Daniel chapter 4 is the last chapter of Nebuchadnezzar's, I don't want to say life, but it's the last we hear of him. So Nebuchadnezzar's been a part of our study through the first 4 chapters of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, we see the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar starting the establishment of his kingdom. He overtakes Israel, Judah, and that's when he takes some of the choice and fit and good, healthy young men, Daniel being one of those and his other 3 buddies, and starts to train them and just to raise them up into wise men that can serve him, right? And so we see that in chapter 1. Daniel is faithful to his God. He doesn't allow the culture, he doesn't allow pressure, he doesn't allow the things that are being taught him to change who he is at his core, which is a follower of Jesus, a follower of God, and submissive to God first and foremost. Then Nebuchadnezzar gets a dream. You guys remember this dream, and it was a pretty interesting dream with this big statue of a man, and in different sections had different material from top to bottom. And Daniel was able to interpret what it meant, and also even share what the contents of what it was, even without being told. And with that, Nebuchadnezzar realized that this is God, right? This is the one true God. But there is a big difference between knowing that, here, and maybe recognizing that here, but then submitting and surrendering is a completely different thing. Repenting of your sin is a completely different thing, right? Because listen to this. James tells us in the book of James that even the demons know who Jesus is, right? And they fear and tremble because they know of his authority, they know of his power, they know of his reign and rule. So they recognize him as God. They know that. There's no doubt about that. Yet, they don't believe in the sense that they don't trust. They don't trust in Jesus Christ as Lord and as Savior. They don't submit to him and surrender to him as King. So they know that he is, but they don't surrender to it. And so the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar happening here is that he knows that this is God, but he doesn't surrender to him as God. Try and pay attention, guys. Look at me, right? And we're going to see this happening over and over again. We see it in Daniel chapter 2. We see it in Daniel chapter 3. We're going to see it a little bit in Daniel chapter 4 until finally, God completely cuts his legs out from underneath him, makes him fall on his knees, and that the only thing he could do was recognize God's authority, his sovereignty, and his goodness, that all his pride was now gone. Humility came so that he could actually recognize God for who he was and surrender and submit to that. So Daniel chapter 2, again, Daniel explains the dream, and all that Nebuchadnezzar really hears in the midst of the dream is that he is the greatest of all, right? Because he is described as the head of the statue that is pure gold. And so he's like, my kingdom's awesome, I'm great, I'm the best, yada, yada, yada. This all happens. Daniel's promoted. His friends are promoted because they prayed with Daniel to receive, the vision, understanding of this. And then we get to chapter 3, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. In chapter 3, now we get to where Nebuchadnezzar makes a golden image. I don't know if it necessarily was of himself, but it was for people to worship and recognize Nebuchadnezzar. And so he sets this decree that whoever doesn't do it, whoever doesn't bow down and worship it, is going to be thrown into a pit of fire. Well, come to find out that 3 of Daniel's buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, aren't going to do that because they only submit to the true king, which is Jesus Christ, correct? So they don't bow down and worship anyone else, right? We're obedient to the authority above us, but we don't bow down and worship them. There's a big difference in that. And so they're not going to bow down, they're not going to worship, even though it means being disobedient to the authority above them. Because ultimately there's a higher authority, and that being God. And so what happened is Nebuchadnezzar, he gets mad. He's like, I'm going to throw you guys in the fire. You guys remember this. You've probably seen it in VeggieTales. Throws them in the fire. He looks in. He's like, oh my gosh, didn't we throw 3 in there? I see 4, right? And he's like, it looks like the Son of God. And so God protects them. Is God always going to do that for every single believer who makes that profession of faith and stands that firm in the midst of adversity and punishment? No. I mean, we read of stories of that in the book of the Foxes of the Martyr, or what's it called? Book of the Martyrs? Foxes of the Martyrs? Fox's Book of Martyrs, thank you. Many different stories of people who gave their life because of their faith, right? Stephen being the very first one that we know of in the book of Acts. And did God save him? No, he died, right? So it's not always going to happen that way. But if it's in God's will, he will do that. And so that was the big theme in verse 18 of chapter 3. They say this, but if not. Remember that? That was the key to that chapter. But if not, like even if God does not save us, we're still not changing our minds. Even if God does not save us, we still believe that he is sovereign and he is king. It's not a matter of his authority and his power that he's not able to save us, but it's because of his sovereignty, right? It's what he's chosen. And we're okay with that. We submit to that. So then, again, they're thrown in the fire. They get brought back out because they don't get burnt. Nebuchadnezzar starts to praise God, right? And he says, everyone now is going to worship this one true God. Have we heard this before? Yes, right? Nothing really changes. And that's where we get into chapter 4, okay? So chapter 4, verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king. So from chapter 4 on, well, really just chapter 4, we're going to see this from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. He is speaking, or he is writing. This is no longer Daniel. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it was good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. That's pretty good, right? That's a pretty good praise coming from Nebuchadnezzar's mouth. I believe, as I've read this, that this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking this after everything has transpired in chapter 4, right? So chapter 4 has already happened as he's speaking the beginning of it. He's looking back upon it, and now he's going to share what has now transpired in his life. Okay, so this is what happens in verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore, I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me. Sounds very similar to chapter 2, right? That they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth. Its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. And it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. And he cried aloud and said thus, Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it, and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. So verse 17 is a transition of Daniel speaking. Verse 18, this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, I'm sorry, that wasn't Daniel speaking, that was the watchman. Now you, Belteshazzar, declare its interpretation. Since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy God is in you. So verses 1 through 3, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes God's sovereignty, recognizes God's goodness, his power, his authority. And we are going to get into the climax of Nebuchadnezzar's spiritual journey, right? All the way from chapter 1, where his pride has risen him up, and now it's even gotten greater and greater from chapter 2 to chapter 3 to chapter 4, where now finally he's going to fall on his face, right? Pride comes before what? And a haughty spirit before the fall. Every single time. Proverbs wisdom with that. Pride comes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It's an equation. It literally means that pride equals destruction. That will come, right? It's a cause and effect. If there is pride in your life, there is pride in your heart, what is natural to come is destruction. Those who have a haughty spirit will fall. And great is the fall. Nebuchadnezzar's fall is great. Do you guys see what happens and transpires within the dream? Obviously, Daniel has not given the interpretation. But there's this tree, right? This mighty tree that everything under it, right? Everything's under it. The umbrella of this tree, life is sustained. You've got the birds, you've got, everything, right? Everything is underneath it. The beasts are under it. The birds are under it. The fruit that comes from it. I mean, it's abundant. It's good. It's lovely, meaning that it's flourishing. This is a literal picture of Nebuchadnezzar, along with his kingdom. Right? Oftentimes in the Old Testament, the prophets would write and describe of kingdoms or great men as trees. Now we know specifically, even without Daniel's interpretation, it doesn't even take the revelation of God to interpret this at this point, but we know that this is speaking of a man, because then in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar says that let him, speaking of the tree, right, start to graze with the beast, be wet with the dew of heaven, and then let his heart be changed from that of a man and be given the heart of a beast. So what do you think the interpretation is? And obviously some of you already know what's going to happen. What do you think the interpretation is for this tree who is now going to be cut down, right? It once was flourishing and it once was great. It's going to be cut down to a stump, and eventually there's going to be this man who is going to change from a heart of man to a heart of a beast, right? Going to be given the heart of a beast, and 7 times will pass over. What's going to happen is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be brought so low that he's going to be like the beasts of the field. In a literal sense. Not that he transforms. What was that book? Whitney, what was that book we read in middle school where they turned into animals? Metamorphosis? Is that what it was? Do you guys remember those books? Shows? Maybe it was a show. Like these kids would turn into bugs or something, or animals. I can't remember. What was it called? Something. Wildcrats? That's your generation. That's like what my kids watch. Yeah, something like that. Essentially, this is what's happening. I don't believe that Nebuchadnezzar turned into a literal animal, right? I don't believe he turned into a real ox. I believe that he started to act like one, right? So technically, hear me out, Nebuchadnezzar was the OG furry, right? I'm just kidding. Now, I do know that furries, they technically don't think they're animals, but they act like animals.
No, they believe that they're in the heart. Furries believe that they're animals. And they use it for their boxing. I witnessed it myself.
So, unfortunately, I don't want to harp on them too much. But you've had to experience, some of you had to experience and seen, yes, people who have fallen into this, I don't know what to call it, a trend or deception, really, because ultimately what Satan does is deceive, and everything that is apart from the truth is deception. So what we fail to realize, listen, I want to encourage you that even if you have friends or acquaintances or people that you know, or maybe even yourself who has, dabbled in it or thought of it, is understand this, is God has created you completely different and separate from an animal. right? You are superior, you are greater, you are more value than an animal. So don't become something lesser than what God has made you, right? Even if it's just for pretend, even if it's just for fun. That's not what it is. Don't deceive yourselves in thinking, it's harmless, it's just for fun, it's just for pretend. No, there is a deception in that where or Satan is trying to deceive you of your value and your identity in God, because you have been created in the image and the likeness of God. Very different than all of other creation, right? And what is happening to Nebuchadnezzar is not a choice compared to what we see in this generation, where they are choosing to act like animals because it's cute or it's fun or it's where they find their identity, but it's a full-blown deception. Again, Nebuchadnezzar is forced to do this because of his pride. And think of it this way. It's not a fun thing. It's not a cute thing. It's a thing for him to break his pride, right? And so when you are forced to do something that's going to break your pride, it's going to be something that is humiliating, right? It's going to be hard. And so we see that happening here with Nebuchadnezzar. And ultimately what it is it's almost like he's going insane, right? But again, here's the thing, is that it's not, and I'm not saying it's a decision for everyone in this time, in this age, but for Nebuchadnezzar, it was not a decision. It was forced upon him so that he could recognize his rightful place before God, right? That he could recognize himself as a creature, as a creation was the wrong word, as a creation of God, and not trying to bring himself up so high like Lucifer tried to do as an equal to God, or as great as God, or a God himself. And so God brings him low, not to destroy him, right? Because ultimately what we're going to see is that, remember the tree that was cut down? What was left behind of that tree? A stump. Why do you think that is? Because it's going to grow back, right? Ultimately what God is doing is he's not destroying Nebuchadnezzar, because he could have gotten rid of the tree completely, but he leaves a little remnant, just enough so that he can be restored and brought back. But it all happens through this humility and ultimately repentance, where God is then going to restore and bring back Nebuchadnezzar to a greater position than he once was. Okay? So let's look at this in verse 1. He says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. The main theme of this chapter, like I've said, is God's sovereignty. It's the fact of his kingdom. We've seen this in all 4 chapters, I believe, that God's kingdom is greater than any of man's kingdoms. Do you guys agree with that? Yes. Because we see, look at history, go visit some archaeological sites, you will see that they're in ruins, right? Because they could not last for a while. Some of them last hundreds of years, maybe, I don't know if any have lasted thousands of years, but the point being is that they can't last. They eventually fall. But God's kingdom, it never will fall. Think about that. Even think about how great our nation is. And you're probably rolling your eyes thinking maybe it's not, but trust me, it's a great nation. We are a strong nation. Are we divided? Yeah. But we are a strong nation, and even the nation of America and whatever other great nations are out there as well, and strong ones and fortified ones, they can all fall. And they all will fall eventually when Christ comes back and establishes his one true kingdom here on earth. Again, the point being is that all these ones that we can put our trust in, we can put our faith in, they're not eternal, right? They're finite. God's sovereignty is the theme of this. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 25, which we didn't read, but the last part of that verse, it says this. It says, they shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you. This is Daniel interpreting this dream. He says, until, this is all going to happen. You're going to act like a beast until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. That is true of Daniel's time with Nebuchadnezzar as the king over Babylon, and it is true of our time, even with our president in America, with Joe Biden, that God is sovereign, right? That no matter how he came into position, whether you believe that he, was truly voted in, or if that it was truly, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, rigged, right? Cheated, whatever it may be. Think of it this way. Do you think God was like, those Americans, they tricked me. They put in all these fake ballots and Joe Biden won and he wasn't supposed to win. Donald Trump got more votes, right? Do you think he was taken aback by that? No. So I don't really care, but I do care that we have a good voting system. I do. But ultimately, I do believe this, that no matter how someone gets into authority, and a position of authority, that God is over it, right? That God is not taken aback by it. That God has planned it and allowed it because he's sovereign. Otherwise, he would not be God. There's no way you and I could trick him. There's no way our whole nation could trick him. That's not a thing, okay? We can't limit God's character and who he is. And so God is sovereign over all kingdoms, whether it was 2,500 years ago or now. God is still sovereign. So verse 2, he says, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. So I believe that as he's stating these 3 verses in the beginning, that everything in chapter 4 has already transpired, and he's coming back and he's telling us what happened. Now, many years have transpired between chapters 3 and 4. I believe this is at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, right? Because his reign was limited. Because eventually what happens to everyone at the end of their life? They die, right? Can God? No. Can the king of heaven, can he be assassinated? No. Can he be overtaken? Nope. None of those things can happen. None of those things that can happen here on earth with the kingdom can happen with God's kingdom. So which one are we going to put our trust in? The one that's faithful, the one that's good, the one that cannot be overtaken. And so he says in verse 2, I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. So he's going to praise and he's going to declare all the good things that God has done to him. And ultimately what Satan wants to do when you have experienced the goodness of God is for you to be quiet about it. I mean, think of the things that we get excited about and we cannot wait to tell people about. And we can't wait to share, these little testimonies in our life about how, I scored this amazing dress for half off. And they had it in my size and there was one left. I'm going to go tell, I'm going to post 3 stories of it. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to tell everyone. Or, I went and I saw this amazing game, whatever it may be. We all fall victim to that, right? It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but when we equate it to, do we do the same thing when it comes to the goodness of God? And we see that happening with Nebuchadnezzar. He says, look, I'm going to declare these things, right? These signs and these wonders. The signs, it speaks of natural phenomena that evidence of supernatural intervention. It could literally only be of God, right? It couldn't equate it to anything else. I couldn't equate it to anything else. And the word means something which points out. And so ultimately what these signs do is they point out God's wisdom and his power and his sovereignty. Now, do signs and wonders, do they bring faith? No, never. Not once in Scripture have I seen signs and wonders bring people to a saving faith in God. Not once. But do they help establish the faith that you already have? I believe so. Because ultimately, what brings faith, guys? What does the Bible tell us that brings us faith in God? It's through the vessel and the means of grace, but ultimately there's a way that faith comes for us, to us. It's in Romans. It says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. So where does faith come from? The Word of God. That's it. Not from, stop asking God to say, or to show you some amazing sign or wonder that he's real. Because he's already done that. I promise you, he's already, dude, look at your own body and how it functions. Tell me that's not a miracle that only God can do and create. The fact that you're alive and all you eat is pizza. That's amazing. All you eat is processed food. Tell me there's not a God. There's your sign and your wonder that God is real, because all you eat is popcorn and goldfish and M&Ms and pizza, right? And you're functioning. It's high functioning, but you're functioning, right? There's these signs and wonders. They're not bad things, but they don't bring about our faith in God. They really establish the faith that we already have in God, right? But God does many signs and wonders, and I think sometimes we miss it because we're looking for the extreme of them. We're looking for a guy to walk on water. We're looking for someone to be brought back from the dead. Can God still do those things? I truly believe. Otherwise, he's not God. Is he still doing those things? I do. I believe. But I think we become so narrowly focused that we miss out on even some great signs and miracles that we've witnessed in our own lives, and sometimes we may not attribute it to God. So again, signs are natural phenomena that evidence of supernatural intervention. Wonders are supernatural manifestations of divine intervention in the course of nature. Basically, the word wonder means something that produces astonishment or awe, right? Astonishment or awe. And he says this about the signs and wonders in verse 3. He gives two verbs to them, or two words, not verbs. He calls them great and mighty. Right? He says, how great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. I believe, again, that this statement happens after everything transpires, because there's no way that Nebuchadnezzar would say this of God's kingdom unless he went through what he went through. That God's kingdom is an everlasting kingdom and that his dominion is from generation to generation. I mean, who was the greatest king to ever live on this earth? It was Nebuchadnezzar. He had the most authority, he had the most power, he had the most riches, he had the most recognition. Yet, how long did it last? A generation, right? Even less than a generation. It did not last long. But God's will last from generation to generation. With you, without you, it will be there. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was temporal. God's is eternal. It's unchanging. And the kingdom of men changes from generation to generation, but again, we know that God's kingdom is eternal and without any change or loss of stability. And this is a remarkable statement from this king, right? From the pride and arrogance that he had, to now be able to say something of another king, of a true king, as an everlasting kingdom. It's a remarkable statement. So verse 4, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I think if I were a king, that's what I would be doing. Is just straight up chilling. Like, I wouldn't want to do anything. What did we just watch? Oh, we watched Thor. The new one. Is it number 4?
They're still coming out though.
I don't know. I think it was number 4. Was it number 4? And I think in the movie, he was a king. No, it was the girl king. The girl king. The queen? No, I think she called herself a king. I don't know. Yes. Anyways, I think if I remember correctly, in the movie, she was upset that basically the whole time that she was like being a king, she was just like overseeing, political things. Like it was boring. Like it was just like I had to deal with this and that. It was just meeting after meeting. Like, dude, if I were a king, I'd be like, I'd set somebody over that and just do what Nebuchadnezzar does. It's just rest, right? And actually, it's recorded in history, or I should say it's not recorded in history, of any political activity happening in 582 to 575 BC when Nebuchadnezzar reigned. So I believe that in that time is when we find this period of rest that Nebuchadnezzar had. So there's no political activity, there's no military undertakings, nothing's happening. And basically, what this means of this time was when he says, when I was at rest in my house, at rest means to be free from fear. Okay, so there was, again, no political things happening, no uprisings, no wars, no battles. It was, in a sense, I would say, peace in the physical sense. But just because everything was going good doesn't mean that there's the absence of fear, right? Let me say it this way. Just because there was no bad doesn't mean that there's no absence of fear. Because what happens directly in verse 5? Even though there's no wars, there's no political activity, he says, I saw a dream which made me what? Afraid, right? Nothing is happening on the outside in the physical world. right? He is just lounging in his wonderful, beautiful palace, yet he's still not at ease. He's still afraid. He's still anxious because a dream comes and he says, the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head, they troubled me. Being unafraid doesn't just come from the absence of things, like not going to war or trials or persecutions or even things going wrong. Being unafraid is not, again, the absence of bad, but I believe it really means it's the presence of good, right? Meaning the good being God. That truly, if you don't have God in your life, then you can never have the stability of peace. Truly. Right? Truly. So he receives the second vision. He's afraid again, just like the first one. He's afraid. So what does he do? He calls people to come and interpret it. So here's the wealthiest man, right? The greatest man to have ever lived in that type of sense. The wealthiest, most authority, most powerful. Yet he was still unhappy and he was still fearful. The man who had everything had what? Nothing. Nothing. And he brought himself up, he built himself up, he saw himself as great, yet he still had nothing. What does that remind you of? Jesus' statement in Mark 8:36, where he says, "For what will it profit a man if he does what? If he gains the whole world, but loses his own soul." Guys, don't fall into the trap or the lie of the enemy that tells you that your joy and your fulfillment can only come from the things of this world. That it can only come from having more followers on social media. That it can only come with more money. That it will only come with more intelligence or a title or a job. Those things aren't necessarily bad things. They're not inherently bad. But when they become our drive and they become our identity and they become the things that we try to obtain and gain, you will gain them and you can gain them, but you will find out probably very quickly, and if not quickly, eventually, that they don't satisfy. They don't. They won't truly satisfy. The only thing that can truly bring fulfillment and joy is God. And if those other things come because God blesses us, great. But that's not what we're striving for. In verse 6, he says, I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. So man's wisdom falls short again. It fails. Right? It will always fail in light of God's wisdom and power and authority. 1 Corinthians 2:14-16 says this, "But the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them because they are spiritually discerned. But he who is spiritual judges all things, yet he himself is rightly judged by no one. For he has known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him, but we have the mind of Christ." The most wise man and wise woman is the one who knows God. To be able to submit and surrender to God's authority and to know him is the wisest, greatest decision you could ever make. It says in verse 8, "But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secrets trouble you, explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation." So the biggest difference between chapter 2 and chapter 4 is in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't tell the guys that they need to tell him the content of the dream. So Nebuchadnezzar actually tells him the dream, and he just needs the interpretation. So he says in verse 10, "These were the visions of my head. While on my bed I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great." So the tree is at the center of this dream. Just like the last dream was a statue, this time it's a tree, and this tree is going to represent his kingdom and he himself most of all. And this tree, him and his kingdom, it grew to great glory and great splendor. That is true of what happened in history. Okay? Again, in the Old Testament, writers often describe nations or great leaders as trees. He says in verse 11, "The tree grew, it became strong, its height reached the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So all these different people are under the umbrella of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. He says, I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, sounds like Dr. Seuss, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. Well, who do you think this watcher is? Who said it? First one. Angel. I believe it's an angel who descends from heaven. He cried aloud and he says this, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze. And the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. So the watcher, who we believe it to be an angel, explains the fate of what is going to happen to this tree. This great, glorious, magnificent tree is going to be chopped down. It's going to lose everything that it was known for. Its strength, its size, its prominence, its beauty, its stability, the fruit, the shelter, everything that it provided, it is going to lose, and it's going to be changed. And then the watcher tells us that the man, or the tree, which is represented by a man, is going to be changed and given what once had a heart of man to now a heart of a beast. And I believe this is what really frightened Nebuchadnezzar. And I think he knew in his mind that he knew what the interpretation was, but he probably wanted confirmation from Daniel. So the watcher says that when it's cut down and it's chopped and there's this stump of the tree, he says, bound it with a band of iron and bronze. And so I believe that these were there for the trumps, two things. I said trumps. First, the stumps, confinement or protection. Okay, so the stump is going to be confined, but it's also going to be protected. So it can no longer have the freedom to be free and great, right? It's going to be confined, but it's also going to be protected because it's going to eventually be restored. Okay, it's going to be brought to its former glory, but not without its surrendering and repenting. Okay? Now again, the tree is not a tree, it's a representation of Nebuchadnezzar. So we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is not going to be completely destroyed, right? He is going to go insane, and it's going to be a crazy insanity, and he's going to be cut down from his former glory, but ultimately for God's purpose to restore him. Because that's what God cares about. God cares about you, right? God cares about you enough that if you walk in your pride, he loves you enough to not completely destroy you, but to destroy you enough that you will actually eventually turn to him and recognize him. Because he cares for you and he loves you, and that's the best thing for you. Again, the watcher says that his heart will be changed from that of a man into that of a beast, and 7 times will pass over. It's assumed, and no one can say this with certainty, but based on some of the other things in the book of Daniel, that oftentimes the word time would refer to a year. So the assumption here is that 7 times refers to 7 years. That for 7 years, imagine this, like some of you have lived barely double that, right? Some of you hadn't even lived double of 7 years. So for half of your lifetime, or more than half of your lifetime, you acted as like a beast in the fields. Could you imagine that? I mean, literally imagine that. Imagine your buddy one day, you're like, where'd he go? Oh, he's over there, munching on the grass. He's acting like an animal. And not for funsies, not to be cute, not to go with the trend, but because God has brought him down from his pride. But not only that, it's not just some random buddy. This is the king of the earth, of the literal earth. The greatest man on earth is now acting like an animal. He's gone so insane that he acts like an animal. And we'll talk about that more next week when we get into the interpretation of the dream. And so verse 17, we're going to try to get to 18 and be done. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over the lowest of men. This is what's going to happen. That God gives and God takes away. That God is sovereign over every single person, but also specifically the rule, the reign, the nations, the governments of man. God is in control. And I think you and I don't have to worry about what's going to transpire in November, right? Many of you, I don't think really any of you can vote this upcoming November. Is that true? No? So really just Miss Brooke, Mr. Donnie, my wife and I? You know, and even though we have the amazing ability to vote, I, just like you who don't have that ability yet, we have to submit to the Lord that He's in control no matter what transpires. No matter what person goes into office, no matter what. No matter what happens, God's in control. And I think we should have peace about that. Wouldn't you agree? And maybe you don't care, because I know at your age, I could care less about what was happening when it came to the government and politics. And really at the end of the day, now at my age that I'm at, I don't care in a sense, because I know God's in control. But I do want to do my part in what God has allowed in the freedom and the giftings that He's given us as Americans. Again, the point being that God's in control, that He's sovereign. Right? God will set up the nations as He wills, and He'll bring them down as He wills. And even He can bring the lowliest men to the greatest of heights. So why would any king, why would any president ever try to uphold themselves and lift themselves up in pride and arrogance, when knowing that literally you and I could be in that position if God willed? Not because you and I are great and have whatever, but He could do it. 1 Samuel 2, 7, 8 through 8 says this, and we'll close. The Lord makes poor and He makes rich. He brings low and He lifts up. He raises the poor from the dust and He lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes and make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and He has set the world upon them. God is always in control with the greatest of things that we see in our life when it comes to nations, but also even the simplest and smallest of things that is happening in your individual life. God is in control.